So I'm a bioarchaeologist, which means that I study human remains from archaeological sites as a source of evidence about people's past experiences, their lifestyles, their health. And my main focus of research has been looking at periods of climate and environmental change in the past and thinking about how sociocultural circumstances and historical trajectories in different human communities create variation in their responses to a changing environment. And most recently, I've been thinking about how to use this knowledge to combat some of the environmental determinism that we find in popular literature about climate change, but also determinist narratives that are commonly underlying policy and planning discourse and decision-making here in the US. And so that's what I want to talk with you about today. So there's no doubt that we live in a warming world and that climate change is a very significant and important challenge facing human societies today. On Thursday, May 9th, 2013, we passed 400 parts per million carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. And that's a level that hasn't been seen since the Pliocene, which is a geological epoch from, about 5.4 to 2.4 million years ago, when the genus Homo first evolved. So the global public is becoming increasingly aware of climate change as we begin to experience its impacts. But in a sense, it's particularly alarming because there's still so much uncertainty about what warmer temperatures will mean in terms of storm activity, natural disasters, food and water supply, rainfall patterns, disease patterning, and really, life on Earth. So climate change is already having an impact on global public health, human security, including food and water security, and migration flows. And governments and non-governmental organizations are considering potential future impacts and creating their plans for managing natural disasters and environmental changes, but they're also making predictions for how societies will respond. Just as the ability to understand physical, geographical, and biological responses to global warming has to rely on historical sciences, making predictions about human behavior and sociocultural change should also be done using historical human sciences of anthropology and archaeology. And of course, as you all know, anthropologists have been conducting research on human environmental interactions for decades. And biological anthropologists have a unique role to play because we bring a biocultural approach to this work, which recognizes the basic interconnectedness of biology and culture for humans as a species, and because our work focuses largely on human variation, which is a critical component of combating environmental determinism. So for decades in the United States, which you may be aware, we have a very serious problem with science denial, but also for decades, a straw man debate has been sort of raging in the public sphere as to whether climate change is real, whether it was caused by humans. And while this public controversy has prevented an organized, effective response to climate change by our government, at the same time, behind the scenes, our governmental agencies, which are responsible for things like managing our natural resources or monitoring our national security priorities, have begun planning for a warmer world. So in 2015, Congress tasked the Department of Defense with identifying the most serious and most likely climate-related risks for military operations, develop mitigation plans for humanitarian aid, global security, capacity building in partner states, and sharing best practices. And they asked them to describe their needs, their resource needs, to conduct these operations. And the Department of Defense issued this report, which you can see here, National Security Implications of Climate Change. And they defined global climate change as an urgent and growing threat to our national security, contributing to increased natural disasters, refugee flows, and conflicts over basic resources such as food and water. So the Department of Defense claimed in this document that the impacts of global warming were already being experienced, of course, and the scope, scale, and intensity was projected to increase over time. And the document as a whole, if you were to go and read it, it's available online, belies a philosophical orientation that the United States, I mean, I'm sure this is not surprising, needs to project power and win decisively as the increasing risk of instability and conflict overseas creates challenges to our national interests. All right. So the Department of Defense, the EPA, and other planning bodies rely on something called human security literature as the basis for their views about the challenges that we're going to face in the context of global warming. And this field of inquiry started out with a quest to define human well-being and vulnerability and how weak or failed states were unable to meet basic human needs. But in the last decade of the 20th century, this field of inquiry turned to focus on the issue of climate change. And despite warnings from some sort of fringe members of this discipline, of course, including a few interloper anthropologists, that this field was becoming overwhelmed by modernist, neo-Darwinian, and ethnocentric perspectives, their concern with human well-being in the face of climate and environmental change has become largely focused on these basic tenets, which in their view are that number one, human nature is deeply, essentially, and biologically violent, that climate change will always lead to environmental migration, which in turn will cause increased competition for resources and civilizational collapse. And you saw these views represented in the Department of Defense report. So they come from this human security literature. And unfortunately, anthropology is almost entirely neglected in this scholarship, despite the inherently anthropological topic. So these scholars in the human security field do not cite the work of archaeologists to describe human environmental relations over the millennia. They're not reading biological anthropology or more specifically, human evolutionary theory either. Instead, they're reading people like Jared Diamond, Steven Pinker, and other popular authors who write these very highly sensationalized books with titles like this one, The Climate Wars, Why People Will Be Killed in the 21st Century. So in a recent analysis of the human security literature, I was, frightened that Jared Diamond is their major source of information about the collapse of past societies. Excuse me. And that, of course, being because Jared Diamond is wrong about the collapse of past societies. And in fact, not only is his work not based in archaeology, but he's even threatened to sue archaeologist colleagues of mine when they try to correct the record that he portrays to a huge popular audience. So in light of the fact that folks at the American Department of Defense and the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, are reading this human security literature, and that the human security scholars are relying on authors like Jared Diamond for information about anthropology, and in light of these misconceptions of human evolution and human nature, and their view that America should be prepared to dominate at all costs in the face of global warming, it becomes imperative that anthropologists begin to address some of these misconceptions that people like Jared Diamond and Steven Pinker have promoted about human nature and about what climate change really means for human populations. So there are some scholarly books where archaeologists have tried to address some of the misconceptions about the collapse of past societies, some of them specifically addressing claims that Jared Diamond has made, but these books are not really for a popular audience. They're more focused on questioning the idea that societies do collapse, or questioning the concept of collapse, or in demonstrating the character of resilience in human groups, which is amazing work and very important. But in the past few years, there's a community of archaeologists and bioarchaeologists who have begun trying to write about variation in human responses to climate and environmental change, and variation in health and other long-term outcomes for a wider audience, including the human security folks. So our research, of course, confirms that resilience is actually the variable of interest for human communities. And I want to turn now to describing my research over the past 15 years in India and particularly in the Indus Civilization, to demonstrate how historical and sociocultural factors contribute to variation in human responses to climate and environmental changes, to characterize some of that range of variation, and to specifically address claims made by the human security field that climate change inevitably leads to migration, which in turn leads to competition, violence, and eventually civilizational collapse. So that was sort of my section where I described why I'm interested in this topic. And now I want to talk about some of my research on the topic. But I'm not going to go into a tremendous amount of detail because this is work that I've been doing for 15 years. And I've included here a few of the relevant publications, and I've included some citations on the slides if you're interested in something specific. Or of course, we can get into it in the question and answer session if anyone wants to. So I've been working to understand biocultural adaptations to environmental and climatic changes in South Asia for most of my career, and I want to talk about this work in two different arenas. So briefly, I want to just very briefly describe some of my work in Deccan Chalcolithic with skeletons from small agrarian villages that were occupied after the end of the Indus Civilization, or throughout the second millennium BC, when these folks also at the end of the second millennium went through a period of environmental change. And then I also want to talk about my work in the urban period of South Asia, the first urban period during the Indus Civilization, which, as you all know, of course, peaked in the third millennium BC, but ended during a period of rapid climate change known globally as the 4.2 Ka event, which was a widespread climatic shift towards more arid conditions from about 2200 to 1900 BC. And in both of these cases, I studied human skeletal remains from people who lived at these sites during what archaeologists refer to as good times, prosperous periods of time, and then also people who chose to remain behind in these settlements after they were largely abandoned in periods of climatic or environmental change. So my goal in this part of the talk is to demonstrate a contrast in the experience of resilience in these very different sociocultural contexts. And obviously, folks in this conference are primarily interested in Indus civilization, but I just want to very briefly begin with my dissertation research when I looked at demographic and childhood health and development, sort of the impacts of climate and environmental changes in a cluster of villages that were occupied in the second millennium BC in West Central India. You all know it as the Deccan Chalcolithic. And of course, these villages were founded in the context of a semi-arid environment. The environment was already semi-arid when folks began to settle here, but towards the end of the second millennium, there was a small shift towards an increasingly arid climate in an event known as the 3.1 Ka rapid climate change event. And this affected human communities from the Mediterranean across West and South Asia. And in India, around 1000 BC, most of these Deccan Chalcolithic settlements that had been flourishing for 1000 years or 1200 years were abandoned. So similar to something that happened in the Indus civilization, right? So one of these settlements that has human remains available for research was occupied across what we think of as the early to late Jorve period. So across this period of environmental change. And that's the site of Inamgaon. And there were some very important, I'm sure you're all familiar, changes with the archaeological record at this time, like a shift from cattle keeping to sheep and goat herding, changes in settlement density, changes in material culture that led archaeologists to suggest that there was a very severe decline across this environmental transition. So I looked at human skeletal remains from 160 infants and children at the site. I performed a biodemographic analysis, which is a kind of multi-scalar approach that recognizes that there's a connection between the growth of children and the growth of populations. So this work demonstrated that population growth in the early Jorve phase at Ingamgaon resembled a pattern that we find in many historical populations. So there was a moderate growth rate, and that was accomplished through moderate levels of fertility and relatively long life expectancy at birth, which is a pattern that is not particularly unhealthy for women. That is a sustainable pattern. But in the late Jorve, despite similar levels of fertility, population size declined because the life expectancy at birth dropped dramatically. So ultimately, this demographic profile suggested that during this period of environmental change in the late Jorve, after 1000 BC, the people who continued to live at Inamgaon for another 300 years after most of this region and most of these sites were abandoned, experienced very high infant mortality, um, higher fertility rates for the women who did survive to adulthood. So while overall fertility rates remained the same, there were fewer women surviving to adulthood. So in actuality, higher fertility rates for those women who survived, and obviously a significant amount of emigration as well. Excuse me. So the infant and childhood growth profiles, I looked at stature differences between the early and late Jorve period. I did a quantification of bone mass, bone strength, and body mass index, quantified the distribution of bone mass across the cross-section of bone. If you take a transverse section of the femur and look at where the bone mass is being distributed, that tells you something about activity levels. And then finally, I quantified bone quality, porosity, and biocultural stress levels. I don't want to go into the details of that work too much, but what I just want to say is that the infant and childhood profiles confirmed that the late Jorve was a very stressful time compared to the early Jorve at the site of Inamgaon. So to be brief, early Jorve peers, somehow I drew on my screen, sorry. Early Jorve children matched their peers for height for age, body mass for height, and in terms of bone quality and quantity at a histological or a microscopic scale. But the late Jorve infants and children demonstrated pretty severe levels of growth suppression and growth derangement at all levels, from the whole bone to the histological scale. So for a large proportion of these children, their stature was stunted and their body mass for stature was similarly reduced. And when I looked at their bones in cross section, it was clear that disruptions to homeostasis had significantly impacted bone distribution and quality at this scale as well. So this work not only spoke to the experience of resilience in the Jorve phase of Indian prehistory, it also speaks to human variation in the face of climate change, and it provides a new method for estimating body mass in infants and children's skeletons, new statistical approaches to age-structured data in bioarchaeology, and new evidence about bone quality in the context of skeletal emaciation. But for our purposes, the point being that in the rural context, if we get back to the climate change story, the combined results of these analyses suggest that people obviously do not always migrate in the face of environmental change. There are a variety of reasons why people would choose to remain in their villages despite environmental changes, despite changes to how they make their living. And it points to the idea too that long-term consequences of the short-term strategies that human populations develop to deal with climate change are not always evident to them. At the start of the late Jorve, it may be that those who remained behind did not foresee that they would end up in a period where you had this increasing infant morbidity and mortality. And perhaps they believed that their strategy was working. They thought that they could make it to the other side of these climate and environmental changes, or perhaps their options for mobility were limited. But also this research demonstrates that the experience of resilience in the face of climate change in rural India in the second millennium BC was one of increased suffering due to starvation, diarrheal diseases, and emaciation for infants and children. So now I want to shift gears and talk about Indus Civilization, a period of time near the end of the Indus Civilization, so a millennium earlier, and the experience of climate and economic changes, urban disintegration, and resilience at the city of Harappa across that 4.2 Ka climate change event. So of course, you all know the Indus Age. I don't have to explain that to you. For our purposes, what's important is that for large cities in the Indus Age, like Harappa, when the 4.2 Ka climate change event began and monsoon rains were disrupted or became more unpredictable and conditions were drier, for the first 200 years, this seems to have stimulated some immigration to the urban centers, or at least it's correlated with immigration to urban centers. But by the end of the urban period, Harappa, had maybe 40,000 residents, and many of them had come from long distances away. But after 200 years of climate and environmental changes, and perhaps more importantly, a lot of disruption to the long distance exchange network where Indus people made a living, most of these cities were depopulated. And the human population reorganized on a massive scale after 2000 BC, 1900 BC. And at the city of Harappa, you have a small population of people who remained behind. And so, like the example that I just showed you in central India 1,000 years later, these skeletons from the 3 burial areas at Harappa offer a window into what this period was like for the urban population, for those who were buried during this transitional phase between the urban and post-urban period, and those who remained in the city during the so-called post-urban period from 1900 to 1700 BC. So my colleagues and I looked at 115 skeletons from 3 different burial areas to characterize this transition at the urban center of Harappa. We looked at material from the urban cemetery, R37, the post-urban cemetery, H, and a pit of bones or an ossuary from the transitional period that's known as area G. And an analysis of interpersonal violence in the skeletal material from these 3 burial areas demonstrates that the risk was pretty low, the risk of violence was pretty low during the urban period. So despite the climatic changes that were already starting, increasingly large and heterogeneous population, there wasn't a high risk for violence, or at least it's not represented in the individuals who were buried at R37. However, during the disintegration phase, when the settlement was largely abandoned, only a small population remained, and resilience can be characterized by a significant increase in cranial trauma. So from 4% in the urban period to 15% in the post-urban cemetery H. And the risk for violence was highest for people whose remains were interred in an ossuary southeast of the urban center. And for the 23 people who were interred here in that pile of bones, 50% of them showed evidence of violent injury. And that was unlike the cemeteries, right? And here too, the patterning was different in the sense that men, women, and children were affected. The injuries that we recorded at Harappa were primarily depression fractures, many of which were examples of what we would call clubbing. Both of the male individuals who could be examined from area G had healed broken noses. One of these individuals pictured here, a middle-aged adult male, also had a perimortem sharp force trauma to the face between his eyes. And of course, copper and bronze weapons capable of inflicting such an injury were found during excavations at Harappa, including axes, adzes, knives, spears. But it's very important to recognize that evidence for traumatic injuries is not limited to the site of Harappa. My academic grandfather, K.R. Kennedy, I was fortunate enough to share this work with him before he passed, but he had also found healed injuries at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. Sharma had reported injuries from Kalibangan. Lee and colleagues have reported cranial trauma at Rakhigarhi. Veena Mushrif Tripeti and Dr. Shinde have documented a cranial depression fracture at Farmana, and Sarkar noted injuries from Lotal. So it is not only Harappa where trauma has been documented. So in another analysis, my colleagues and I also documented evidence for infectious disease that was previously unknown for Indus Civilization. And that included both leprosy and tuberculosis. And it was particularly prevalent in the specimens, again, the individuals, again, from Area G, but also in the cemetery H materials. And so the major conclusions from that project were that for this heterogeneous urban population at Harappa, the experience of climate change was very different from that of Chalcolithic people that I described earlier. So culture contact had probably led to the introduction of new infectious diseases in the urban period. There was, this loss of social control in the post-urban period, and that was associated with this increase in interpersonal violence, as well as increase in the prevalence of infectious diseases, particularly in the more marginalized burial sample from Area G. And then, we can also say that the experience of resilience also included micronutrient deficiencies in the post-urban chalcolithic sample of perinatal and infant remains for people who continued to live at Harappa until 1300 BC. So the presence of scurvy in perinates and infants from the site demonstrates that by that time, some pregnant females were unable to meet their nutritional requirements for vitamin C, which are fairly minimal requirements. And that suggests a very deep derangement of the subsistence system before these last individuals, people, finally abandoned the city. And these results are interesting for a variety of reasons. This is actually the oldest skeletal evidence for leprosy in the world by about 1500 years. So it speaks to debates about the origin and migration and evolution of a very relatively poorly understood disease. Also, the Indus Civilization, I'm sure you all know, had previously always been depicted as this rare example of an entirely peaceful urban civilization with no evidence for interpersonal violence. And this turns out to be untrue when you consult the human skeletal material. And it also sort of rehumanizes these populations because in some, you could look at it that in one way, which is that saying that this was an entirely peaceful urban civilization, that's a rare exception in the world, is a little bit dehumanizing. And it demonstrates an experience too of resilience that's very different from that rural population, as I mentioned before, where you have this foundation of social inequality and high levels of culture contact and travel and trade. And that is leading to this presence and prevalence of infectious disease that's increasing over time, as well as the increase in interpersonal violence. So perhaps more interestingly, leprosy and tuberculosis and violence, I mentioned before, are most common in the folks who were buried not in the city cemeteries, but in Area G. And these folks were in a very atypical deposit for the city. We don't know that much about Area G, and of course it requires additional excavation, which I'm hoping will happen. But this atypical deposit consisted primarily of isolated skulls, crania, and mandibles, and a single prone skeleton for which we have skeletal evidence of decapitation, which you can see here. and the head was placed off to the left of the body. And these folks were all buried beneath a similarly arranged deposit of ceramics, vessels that were similarly piled. And it appears that the risk of leprosy and interpersonal violence may have been structured by social division and inequality, not as the human security literature would have predicted as a result of necessarily migration or conflict over resources because of climate change, but rather it suggests specific health impacts related to social inequality, community membership, and a moment of crisis. So when we look at the big picture of climate and environmental changes in prehistoric South Asia, we find that this 4.2 Ka event in South Asia was experienced in a very different manner between the rural and the urban context. And we also find that you, one of the consequences of environmental crisis um, is that you may have emaciation and starvation in the rural context. And another consequence of environmental change and the associated sociocultural changes that go with it is that you may have increases in infectious disease or changes in the presence and prevalence of diseases in the more urban context. But I'm also interested, sort of beyond health outcomes, in how climate change opens a space for culture change. So, for example, I've recently been looking into more mortuary traditions during Indus and other periods in South Asia. And I just wanted to talk briefly, rather than how environmental change may be shaped by sociocultural variables, how is it that sociocultural variables may change in the face of climate change? So, leprosy or infection with Mycobacterium leprae is arguably the most stigmatized human condition um, in South Asia today, but really globally through time. People with leprosy are excluded from society, from their families. They're restricted to their own settlements outside of other larger human communities. Um, they're often these places where they live will be built along the riverbanks, which are very liminal spaces, strongly associated with devotion and ritual and pilgrimage on one hand, but also strongly associated with death and outcast people on the other. And this marginal social position could be perceived as an opportunity for enhanced degree of individual agency, as people with leprosy may take on a new existence free from other kinds of expectations and norms or traditions. However, social stigma is often deeply internalized by people with leprosy, and as a result, they may not seek or receive treatment for the disease, and therefore the physical effects may become particularly disfiguring, may be considered disabling. And this stigma is not it doesn't come from a biologically rational place. Most contemporary humans at this point are immune to the disease. Leprosy is only expressed in 5 to 10% of people that are infected with M. leprae. It also has a very long incubation period, a long latency period before its effects will be experienced. It requires prolonged exposure for infection to occur. And it's difficult to be certain, but many people don't develop symptoms for decades after infection. It's also imminently treatable. I'm sure you all know there's multi-drug therapies that are effective and that would prevent disfigurement if the disease were caught early and treated. But because of the stigma, these biological facts about leprosy are moot in the face of social facts about leprosy. And so the extreme level of social suffering that is caused by the disease is due to this very deep level of stigma. And people with leprosy today um, I mean, leprosy is often conceived of as resulting from a very extreme level of spiritual pollution going back through generations and previous incarnations of the self. And so, even though biologically speaking, the disease has low communicability, spiritual pollution is readily contagious and transferred even just through the touching of a shadow or laying eyes on a person who's affected. And stigma results from a process of othering, where differences are recognized and constituted and signified as negative and potentially harmful. And then surveillance, control, exclusion, or even imprisonment are deemed justified and necessary to avoid contamination. And this has happened to people with leprosy globally, like all around the world through time. And this process is fully explicated in Madness and Civilization by Foucault, where he made the argument that to understand the othering process and to write the history of this disease and the stigmatization of this illness, we must start from what he called a 0 point, which is a time before the illness became differentiated from a non-illness, before it was constituted as bad, before its recognition led to confinement and surveillance. Um, so leprosy appears to have entered the subcontinent's human population during the Indus Age. And this knowledge provides us with an opportunity to examine the history of stigmatization of leprosy and its sufferers in South Asia. So mortuary symbolism can demonstrate something about social relations between actors and their situations. And then textual traditions too can provide a common ground for interpretation. So an examination of mortuary archaeology at Harappa confirms my prediction that we would not see evidence for differentiation in the burial of people with leprosy at the 0 point during the more urban period in cemetery R37. In fact, people with leprosy were buried in the cemetery. The location of their graves, the orientation and posture of the body, the number and type of grave goods, all of these were within the range of variation for unaffected individuals. And there's no demonstrable difference between people with leprosy and those who were apparently unaffected by the disease. Through time, the mortuary treatment for people with leprosy changes. And in the post-urban cemetery, all of the individuals with obvious skeletal evidence for the disease were buried, and their feet were not present. Now, whether the feet had been present when the person was buried is a little bit unclear because, of course, these are from the Vats excavations. They're very ancient archaeological methods that were being used. Not that they weren't good, because they were actually very good for the time, but it's unclear whether the bones themselves were present. So this is a hypothesis that requires additional testing at additional sites, but it's possible that removal of the feet suggests a recognition, a differentiation, a signification of the disease. Now, there's no evidence still for stigmatization in the post-urban period. People with leprosy were still buried in Cemetery H. There's no aspect of mortuary behavior other than the lack of the feet that is different from folks who have visible signs of leprosy as opposed to folks who do not. It's just that there's that one thing that signifies these burials as slightly different. And of course, there is reference to leprosy in many, many texts, including Atharva Veda, which at the time, I mean, I'm not suggesting that the people of Harappa wrote the Atharva Veda. I'm suggesting that it can be used to understand how people during the second millennium BC understood disease. And leprosy seems to have been recognized even then as a mark of corruption, possibly indicating that this disease was also seen as a sign of spiritual pollution, but it was also seen as treatable. And through the use of Ayurveda and incantations, the stain of the disease could be removed and its effects could be mitigated or destroyed by ritual practice. And so perhaps that's reflected in these attempts to remove a very significantly impacted part of the body. It's interesting to note that it is the feet that were not present because, um, unlike other skin conditions or infections like tuberculosis, there's peripheral neuropathy associated with leprosy, which strongly impacts the feet. And then, of course, at this point in time, feet too are considered a very polluted part of the body, even in the absence of disease. So also interesting, but to conclude, leprosy emerges in the archaeological record of South Asia during this urban period. It was not strongly differentiated or stigmatized at that time, according to mortuary behavior, but it may have become differentiated. We may see the beginnings of an othering process at Cemetery H in the post-urban phase during this moment of climate and environmental crisis. There's some supporting evidence for this from the site of Balatal, where I have also worked, where there was a very large stone enclosure constructed at the northeastern edge of the village during the Indus Age. And this stone enclosure, which is 500 meters square, was filled with 13 layers of burned and vitrified cow dung ash, as well as the skeleton of a man who was very significantly impacted with leprosy. The associated radiocarbon dates indicating the latter half of the, well, between 2000 and 2500 BC, roughly. And this was a very clear case of leprosy and a very interesting case of deviant burial. And of course, cow dung today is the single most pure substance on earth, according to certain Vedic traditions. And so his interment within these layers is suggestive. And it could be viewed as providing support for that hypothesis that by the end of the second millennium BC, attempts were being made in mortuary treatment of people with leprosy to somehow ameliorate the effects of the disease or purify the body for its journey to the afterworld. So I just want to end by saying, with this quote from Amitav Ghosh, the Anthropocene has reversed the temporal order of modernity. Those at the margins are now the first to experience the future that awaits all of us. And it is they who confront most directly what Thoreau called vast, titanic, inhuman nature. Obviously, more than 1.3 billion people live in India today, and the population is distributed unevenly, as you know, between the urban, massive urban or metropolitan areas versus rural villages. Like the prehistoric context, urban centers are relying primarily on an exchange economy, while rural folks are subsisting primarily still on rain-fed agriculture from, laboring on small family holdings. And like the prehistoric context, but on a much larger scale, we're facing this period of rapid climate change combined with rapid population growth, massive systems of global economic inequality, and we're undergoing a third epidemiological transition in which emerging and re-emerging infectious diseases, which we're all experiencing right now, may also be met with widespread antibiotic resistance. So unlike the prehistoric context, of course, the magnitude of climate change today is much greater. Opportunities for migration are restricted and regulated. And we're already seeing impacts to human health and security. So it's absolutely critical that anthropologists speak to these policy and planning communities around the world and require them to take an evidence-based approach, and one that's informed by anthropology when they're making predictions about human responses to climate change. And to inform them that really, there's a lot of human variation based on historical and sociocultural circumstances. It is not necessarily the case that migration and competition and violence and civilizational collapse are going to be the outcome. It's not preordained by human evolution or human nature. These just represent some of the many possibilities, but they result primarily not from climate change, but rather from these systems of inequality and from exclusion to the access to basic resources. And so we also know that these moments of rupture, these dramatic moments of climate change, can create spaces for changes to systems of power. Power can become asserted in new ways. This can lead to these kinds of moments of rupture to sociocultural changes. And so it's imperative that we create some intentionality around these changes to create a more equitable future. And that is it for me. I almost took up my entire time. I'm sorry, but thank you so much for your attention. And if you have any questions, we have a few minutes left. And I just wanted to, acknowledge all of the many organizations and people who have worked on these projects with me or have allowed me the opportunity to do this research or to present it and to say thank you.